The spring of 1,968 inches, Memphis, Tennessee, was charged with an electricity that felt less like the renewal of the season and more like the gathering of a storm. The city was the epicenter of a struggle that defined a generation, a focal point where the grand ideals of the civil rights movement met the gritty, unresolved economic realities of the American working class. It was here, amidst the strike of sanitation workers demanding dignity and fair wages, that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived, determined to lend his voice to the voiceless. He spoke of mountaintops and promised lands, words that would soon echo with a haunting, prophetic resonance. But while the world looked to Dr. King for hope, a darker narrative was being written in the shadows, one of calculation, malice, and a rifle sight trained on a balcony. What occurred on the 4th of April 1968 was not just a tragedy. It was a seismic event that shattered the composure of a nation. Yet, beyond the immediate heartbreak and the smoke rising from American cities in the days that followed, there began one of the most complex, high-stakes criminal investigations in the history of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a manhunt that would span continents, relying on the cutting-edge forensics of the era and good old-fashioned police work to track a ghost across the globe. This is the story of how law enforcement pieced together the fragments of a broken moment to bring a fugitive to justice. This is the investigation into the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. To understand the investigation, one must understand the geography of the crime scene. The Lorraine Motel was a modest establishment, a safe haven for African American travelers in a segregated South. Dr. King was staying in room 306 on the second floor. Across the street, overlooking the motel's pool and balcony, stood a rooming house, the rear window of which offered a direct line of sight to the door of room 306. Below the rooming house was Kneipp's Amusement Company. This proximity is critical because, in the chaotic moments following the single shot that rang out at 6:01 p.m., the geography of the street dictated the evidence that would be left behind. The shot itself was a singular, thunderous crack that severed the evening air. Dr. King, who had been standing on the balcony speaking with associates in the parking lot below, collapsed immediately. The injuries were catastrophic. While we will not dwell on the medical specifics, it is important to note that the trauma was severe enough to render emergency medical intervention futile. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead an hour later. But while the ambulance sirens were still wailing, the machinery of the investigation had already roared to life. Witnesses at the motel pointed across the street. They had seen smoke rising from the brush area near the rooming house. Simultaneously, a man was seen fleeing the rooming house, moving with frantic haste. In his panic to escape the scene before the police net tightened, this fleeing figure made a critical error, one that would ultimately become his undoing. As he exited the building and turned onto the sidewalk, he spotted a police car entering the area. Spooked, he dropped a heavy bundle wrapped in a green bedspread in the doorway of Kneipp's Amusement Company and sprinted toward a white Ford Mustang parked nearby. He tore away from the curb, disappearing into the Memphis traffic just minutes before the area was locked down. That bundle, abandoned on the sidewalk, was a forensic goldmine. When investigators carefully unrolled the green bedspread, they found the physical anchor of the entire case. Inside was a Remington Game Master Model 760 .30-06 caliber rifle, a pair of binoculars, a portable radio, a newspaper, and a few articles of clothing. It was as if the perpetrator had handed the police a roadmap to his identity, provided they could decipher the clues. The Memphis police, soon joined by the FBI, began the meticulous process of analyzing the contents of the bundle. The rifle was the primary focus. The serial number on the weapon was intact, allowing agents to trace its provenance immediately. The trail led to a sporting goods store in Birmingham, Alabama, called the Aero Marine Supply Company. Records showed that the rifle had been purchased just days earlier by a man identifying himself as Harvey Lohmeyer. But the investigation into Harvey Lohmeyer revealed that he was a phantom, a fake name used solely for the purchase. The description given by the clerk, however, matched the descriptions of the man seen fleeing the rooming house. A white male, slender, dark hair. While the ballistics experts worked to match the test-fired bullet from the Remington to the fragments recovered from the victim, a match that would eventually be confirmed, the latent fingerprint experts were examining the other items in the bundle. The map, the binoculars, and the rifle itself yielded a series of prints. But in 1968, there was no instant computerized database that could scan millions of prints in seconds. Fingerprint identification was a manual, labor-intensive art form requiring the human eye to compare loops, whorls, and arches against physical cards on file. Without a suspect to compare against, the prints were useless. The investigators turned to the other items. The portable radio had a prisoner number scratched off, but microscopic analysis helped recover the serial number. The laundry marks on the underwear and the clothing tags provided another avenue. The FBI, under the immense pressure of a grieving and angry nation, deployed over 3,000 agents to the case. They scoured laundry records across several states, looking for the specific alphanumeric code found on the collar of a shirt in the bundle. The breakthrough came from combining these disparate threads. The investigation into the Harvey Lohmeyer alias led them to a series of other aliases used in the weeks leading up to the assassination. The suspect had also used the name Eric Starvo Galt. As Eric Galt, the suspect had lived in Birmingham and had purchased the white Mustang seen fleeing the scene. By tracing the registration of the Mustang and the history of Eric Galt, agents found a trail of receipts, dance lesson registrations, and bartending school applications. This was a man trying to construct a life, or perhaps a cover, but he left paper trails everywhere he went. The Galt trail led investigators to a rooming house in Atlanta, where the white Mustang was eventually found abandoned in a parking lot. The car was dusted for prints, and the interior was vacuumed for fibers and soil samples. The map found in the bundle in Memphis had markings on it, specifically pencil circles around the area of Dr. King's home in Atlanta and his church. This established premeditation. The suspect had been stalking the civil rights leader. But who was Eric Starvo Galt? The name, like Lohmeyer, was an alias. The FBI needed the true identity. The breakthrough happened when the latent prints from the rifle and the Mustang were finally run against the databases of fugitives. The Bureau suspected that a criminal with such operational awareness likely had a prior record. They were right. The fingerprints belonged to James Earl Ray, a career criminal and escapee from the Missouri State Penitentiary. James Earl Ray was not a sophisticated political operative in the traditional sense. He was a drifter, a petty thief, and a man who had spent much of his adult life in and out of the correctional system. He had escaped prison in a bread truck a year prior to the assassination. Now, the FBI had a name and a face to put on the most wanted posters in the world. The manhunt shifted from a whodunit to a where is he. By the time Ray was identified, he was already gone. The investigation revealed that Ray was a man of high mobility. He had driven from Memphis to Atlanta, abandoned the car, and then boarded a bus to Detroit, eventually crossing into Canada. In Toronto, the fugitive demonstrated a cunning ability to blend in. He scoured birth announcements in local newspapers to find real names of living people he could assume. He adopted the alias Ramon George Sneed. Using this new identity, Ray obtained a Canadian passport. This was a critical failure in the security systems of the time, but it highlighted Ray's resourcefulness. With a fraudulent passport in hand, he flew to London, England. His movement suggested he was trying to reach Rhodesia or South Africa, countries where white minority rule was still in effect, and where he believed he might find sanctuary or work as a mercenary. The FBI, working in conjunction with Scotland Yard and other international agencies, tracked his movements through money orders and travel records. They learned he had traveled from London to Lisbon, Portugal, and then back to London. He was running low on funds and options. The net was closing, but the ocean between the investigators and the suspect made the coordination difficult. On the 8th of June 1968, 2 months after the assassination, the manhunt came to an end at Heathrow Airport in London. Ray, under the name Ramon George Sneed, was attempting to board a flight to Brussels. A customs official, reviewing the passenger list against a watch list of suspects provided by the FBI and Scotland Yard, noticed a discrepancy. When Ray presented his passport, the official noted that he was carrying a loaded revolver in his pocket, a desperate insurance policy for a man on the run. He was detained immediately. The arrest of James Earl Ray was a triumph of international police cooperation. It was the result of thousands of hours of checking hotel registries, analyzing handwriting samples, and following the faint electronic and paper trails left by a man trying to disappear. He was extradited back to the United States to face trial in Memphis. The legal proceedings that followed were anticipated to be the trial of the century. The evidence against Ray was overwhelming, yet largely circumstantial. There were his fingerprints on the murder weapon. There was the purchase of the gun under a known alias. There was the white Mustang. There was the flight from the scene and the subsequent international escape. However, there was no confession, and Ray was a man who knew how to manipulate the legal system. Ray hired Percy Foreman, a high-profile defense attorney known for his theatrical courtroom style and his ability to save clients from the death penalty. Foreman reviewed the evidence and gave Ray a stark assessment. If he went to trial, the prosecution would almost certainly secure a conviction. And in Tennessee in 1968, that meant the electric chair. Foreman advised Ray to plead guilty in exchange for a sentence of 99 years. It was a deal designed to save his life. On the 10th of March 1969, James Earl Ray stood before a judge in Memphis and entered a plea of guilty to the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. The plea was accepted. There was no long, drawn-out trial, no parade of witnesses, no cross-examination of the ballistics experts. The state presented the facts of the case to put them on the record. Ray accepted the sentence, and he was transported to the Tennessee State Penitentiary to serve his time. However, the story did not end with the slam of the cell door. Almost immediately after arriving in prison, Ray recanted his confession. He claimed he had been coerced by his attorney and that he was a patsy in a larger conspiracy involving a mysterious figure named Raoul. Ray claimed that Raoul had directed his movements, instructed him to buy the rifle, and told him to rent the room, but that he, Ray, had not fired the shot. This recantation fueled decades of speculation and conspiracy theories. The idea that a lone, small-time crook could assassinate such a heavily protected and prominent figure seemed implausible to many. The House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the investigation in the late 1970s. They conducted a thorough review of the evidence, including re-examining the ballistics and the trajectory of the shot. Their conclusion was nuanced. They affirmed that James Earl Ray was the shooter, the forensic evidence linking him to the rifle, and the scene was undeniable. However, they also concluded that there was a likelihood of a conspiracy, suggesting that Ray might have been motivated by a financial bounty offered by others, though no other specific individuals were ever conclusively indicted or convicted by the federal government. Despite Ray's numerous appeals and his attempts to claim innocence until his death in 1998, the physical evidence remained the cornerstone of the historical record. The bundle dropped in panic was the silent witness that never changed its story. The fingerprints did not lie. The purchase records of the rifle were hard facts. The Raoul figure was never found, nor was any credible evidence of his existence ever produced that could withstand judicial scrutiny. The impact of the investigation went beyond the conviction of one man. It revolutionized the way the FBI and local law enforcement agencies communicated. The establishment of the National Crime Information Center became a vital tool, allowing agencies to share data on stolen cars, fugitives, and stolen property instantly. The manhunt for Ray proved the necessity of this centralized information hub. Furthermore, the forensic analysis of the rifle and the trajectory became a case study in criminalistics. The ability to match a bullet fragment to a specific barrel is a science that has only improved since then, but the foundational principles applied in 1968 remain valid. The case highlighted the difficulty of tracking a suspect who uses low-tech methods, changing names, using cash, moving constantly in a pre-digital age, and how persistent, dogged police work is the only countermeasure. But the legacy of this case is not found solely in police manuals or legal briefs. It is found in the city of Memphis and the nation at large. The Lorraine Motel, once a scene of tragedy, was transformed into the National Civil Rights Museum. It stands today not just as a memorial to Dr. King, but as an educational center that teaches the history of the struggle for human rights. The room where Dr. King spent his final hours has been preserved. A time capsule of 1968, reminding visitors of the man behind the movement. The assassination also forced a reckoning within the judicial system regarding the protection of high-profile targets and the handling of political violence. It underscored the fragility of leadership and the terrible power of a single individual with a weapon. It serves as a grim reminder that while ideas are bulletproof, the people who carry them are not. In the end, the justice system did what it was designed to do. It identified the perpetrator through evidence, it pursued him across borders, and it secured a conviction that removed him from society. James Earl Ray died in prison, serving the life sentence he agreed to. The closure of the legal case, however, leaves open the broader questions about the hate that fueled the act. As we look back on the events of April 1968, we are left to reflect on the nature of justice itself. Was a 9-year sentence sufficient for the theft of a life that meant so much to so many? Does the capture of the gunman heal the wound inflicted on the national psyche? The files are closed, the evidence is stored, and the history books are written. But as you consider the meticulous work of the detectives who chased a ghost from Memphis to London, one must ask, in a world still wrestling with the same divisions that Dr. King sought to heal, have we truly learned the lessons of the past? The silence of the Lorraine Motel balcony today is a heavy one. It asks us to remember not just how Martin Luther King Jr. died, but how he lived, and to recognize that while an investigation can solve a crime, only the people can finish the work.